Now we'll start off with the session 2 of the Islamabad Security Dialogue. The session 2 is on economic security at the core. The session will discuss economic security and globalization, sustainable development partnerships in environment and energy, and the economic outreach through economic diplomacy. The session convener is Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Sadat. Sir, kindly join us on the stage. Thank you, sir. Air Chief Marshal Sadat is President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies and former Chief of Air Staff, Pakistan Air Force. Air Chief Marshal Sadat is also the Patron-in-Chief of Thinkers Forum, Pakistan. I hand over the session proceedings to Air Chief Marshal Sadat. Over to you, sir.
The topic of this session is Economic Security at the Core, a title which reflects the centrality of economic security at the government's vision for an adaptive and all-encompassing security paradigm. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important for us all to acknowledge that a country's economic security must remain a foremost priority within its overall security calculus, because a well-functioning, dynamic, and robust economy helps to bolster the other pillars of national security. The government has keenly expressed such thinking, and the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies has remained highly attuned to the importance of economic security since its inception in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, CASS is an independent think tank that specializes in research on key issues pertaining to aerospace, security, and economics. Despite its nascent development, I'm proud to say that CASS has productively and proactively engaged with many facets of the wider security domain, including the nexus of economy and security. It has made a clear distinction between national defense and national security, and work toward evolving policy suggestions toward promoting the latter. Another point that needs to be recalled is what Clausewitz said, that war is a continuation of politics with or by other means. Economics is an important part of politics, as has been demonstrated by the actions of international financial institutions as well as Financial Action Task Force. To get out of their clutches, we need economic sovereignty, and that can only be achieved if economics is the focus of all policymaking. I believe that today's session will help to enrich our common understanding of economic security at the core through the rich insights of speakers and participants today. For this session's keynote address, I have the pleasure of inviting His Excellency, Mr. Abdul Razak Dawood, Advisor to the Prime Minister on Commerce, Textile, Industry, Production, and Investment. Mr. Dawood is a noted philanthropist, businessman and public figure who through his many efforts has made notable contributions to Pakistan's economy over the years. Without further ado, I take this opportunity to invite you for your keynote address, sir. Please come on this stage. Would you like to speak from here?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable Chair, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. It is indeed an honor for me to be here at the Islamabad Security Dialogue to speak about the all-important subject of economic security. The concept of economic security has recently started to getting the attention it deserves here. It is a broad concept, and I will confine myself to a few elements of it, otherwise I'll be talking much longer. Ensuring national security is the primary responsibility of the state, and it is closely related to economic security. A nation's power, influence, and its economic security are deeply intertwined. Economy as the core of its national power, and all other elements revolve around it. I've always believed that in order to strengthen national security, a nation needs economic security. In other words, a strong economy will enhance the country's power, influence, and importance, and hence, through those strengths, strengthen the national security. This has been well brought out by Dr. Paul Kennedy in The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, wherein he shows that the British financial strength, its economic strength, was the single most decisive power in achieving its imperial objectives during the 18th and 19th century. History has taught us that economic backwardness, failure to create jobs, thus leads to social conflict, political instability, and therefore weakens the national security. Economic security, thus, is the basis of national security, and loss of economic security leads ultimately to loss of erosion of national and national sovereignty at its core. We have recently gone through that. I know the pains this government went through right at the start when we had to go to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and put your hand out. Where is your national security? Where is your strength? Where is your importance? Where is your influence when you have to ask to be saved? It was a pretty embarrassing situation, and I know the pain the Prime Minister also went through. Nothing demonstrates this better than the disintegration of the Soviet Union. We saw it before our own eyes. It's a classical case of ignoring economic security, culminating in the breakup of the Soviet Union and the loss of national power and security. The meaning of security has evolved and emphasized that it is not the military dimension alone. Rather, it has become a holistic concept. And within that concept, it's the economic part that really holds the key. Ladies and gentlemen, economic security is a complex and multifaceted concept. It is a dynamic concept which is continuously influenced by the changing global environment. I see economic security as a system based on several pillars. There are several pillars on which that economic security stands on. However, I will talk of some of them. I would like to start with industrial security, industrial base as an element of security. To me, it is the core. A nation of our size cannot just depend on importing goods and just being a trader. But we have to, a nation of 200 and odd people, 200 odd million people, we can't, we just cannot survive. And the last few years have shown to us very clearly that you can't do it. It's not possible. And trading and allowing the industrial base to erode, as we did in the last few years before this government came in, is a real, to me, a wake-up call. Security comes through job creation. Security comes through understanding technology and know-how. And if you're up at full employment, your security becomes greater. It's inherent in it. Security comes through a strong engineering base, process industry, IT base. Security comes from a vibrant and a large private sector. And here I want to talk particularly because people don't like it in this country. And I've always felt that this is something that when you look at other countries, and I'll just talk about it, it is an important element of that security. And that is very, very large corporations. And you say to yourself, but how can that be part of the security? Ladies and gentlemen, a vibrant private sector and a very large corporate sector within that private sector is an element of security. Let's look at Korea. Look at India. Look at Malaysia. Look at Thailand. They have large corporations, and I'm talking very large. Just look at China, and this is very interesting. Not many people would probably know it. As China started to grow, as a state policy, they said, we will create large corporate sectors, so large that they will be able to become members of the Fortune 500. Fortune 500, private and public companies in China to become an element of economic security. How many have we got? None. Our largest corporation, only exports $300 million. Where is that security? Where is that reach? Where is that connectivity? We don't have it. So that's why I say even large corporations are absolutely important. So what did we do when this government came in? We put down that Make in Pakistan. has to be a fundamental element. As I just said, there was de-industrialization going on, and now it's reversed, and we're going back to Make in Pakistan policy. Now, how do we do this? Several elements, and you've seen what the State Bank did, again, to increase this Make in Pakistan by the various schemes that they brought in, including turf, which was the most popular one. Rationalizing tariff structure and pursuing an import substitution policy. An import substitution policy pursued in time leads to a critical mass inside the country for that particular goods. And once you have that critical mass, then you are ready for exports. And that's how the cycle goes on. So, taking a break from the past, and I will say, taking a break from the past, by embarking and using tariff as a tool to stimulate industrial economic activity in the country, as opposed to revenue-based approach in the past. As a businessman, I have seen it over the last 40 years, how our pursuit of revenue has hampered our industrial base, has hampered our economic development, and with it comes joblessness, etc., etc. So, one of the elements was, now let us switch. And I'm happy to say that to pursue this thing, the Prime Minister agreed to transfer the tariff setting from the FBR to the Ministry of Commerce. And now today, it's the Ministry of Commerce that drives it, and it drives it because it wants to increase its industrial base. Well, today, how are we doing? We're nowhere near out of the woods, but the good thing is our direction is absolutely correct. We are now moving in the right direction, though we all know that industrialization is a long-term process. Strong industrial base supported by energy security, food security, both these are a key element of economic security. Energy, food, and agriculture are vital to our economic security. All three of these are absolutely linked together in the context of our geopolitical location. Another interesting thing, again, we are weak on this, and hence our economic security is poor. Most countries build their economic security by trading with their neighbors. Pakistan is one of the weaker countries. Whereas Europeans trade up to 80–90% with their neighbors, we trade 5–7% with our neighbors. And so this recent change that the Prime Minister has agreed, we are reaching out to Afghanistan, we're reaching out to Iran, we're reaching out to Uzbekistan, through Uzbekistan to the Central Asian republics. From the Central Asian republics, we move into go west into the Russian Federation, and another approach to Europe. Unless we say to ourselves that we have to look upon Afghanistan as a strategic partner in trade, rather than a strategic depth in our other securities. Our security with Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and beyond will come through trade and more trade and more trade. Inshallah, a day will come that we will be able to do this with India. Ladies and gentlemen, this leads to another pillar in our economic security, and that is connectivity. We want to go out, we want to trade, we want to reach out to the world. How are we doing on our connectivity? Connectivity by air, by sea, rail, road, and in today's world, by internet. Pakistan, how strong are we when we look at our air linkage, our air connectivity? We know that what the situation is in PIA. Another very weak security that it really bothers me is that Pakistan has only 11 ships of its own which has the Pakistan flag on it. Bangladesh has 250. They were behind us. They have 250 of their own ships plying the oceans. We have 11. Where is our security? Something goes wrong. Can we move our goods? We can't. So these are the areas. And another element of security which never comes up in our discussions, and I've been talking to the Prime Minister on this, there are certain elements in our economic thinking where we must always have surplus capacity. Because if we don't have surplus capacity, we will lose a part of our economic security. And if we have surplus capacity as a planned thing, it means we're buying our insurance. What are those? Port capacity. Pakistan can never get itself in a situation where we don't have adequate port capacity. We have it right now. Will we have it 5 years from now? Will we have it 10 years from now? We don't know. But we have to put it in our strategic planning. Internet and bandwidth. In this day and age, if we lose out on that, where are we going to be? Oh, connectivity is through the internet. Surplus electricity and gas. We know what we went through several years ago when there was not enough electricity to run our industry, to have in our homes. Today we have surplus electricity, alhamdulillah, but it's got to be an element of state security, our own economic security, that we must always have surplus electricity. Same thing goes for gas. Another key element in that security and having surpluses, do we have adequate food reserves supported by a strong agriculture? We know what we've gone through in the last 8-9 months, desperately having to import wheat. Suppose the world refused to give us wheat. Where is our economic security? And suppose we had to buy wheat at any price. Where is our economic security? These are all vital elements. The summation of all this ultimately lands on our national balance sheet. So you come to the next pillar, which is our financial security. This financial pillar rests on provisions of a stable and functioning financial system freedom to implement independent monetary policy, exchange rate stability, internal and external debt, our foreign exchange reserves, and servicing of our international loans. This, to me, is perhaps the most glaring weakness that we have. Financial security is perhaps the most difficult situation we inherited by this government. We've had to go in our history 23 times to the IMF since independence. 23 times. Where is our security when we always have to go for a bailout? One of the things that the Prime Minister has said to us very clearly, that let us work hard to make sure that this time when we're in the IMF and when we come out, it should be the last time we go to the IMF. Going to the IMF is a classical example of erosion of national sovereignty due to economic insecurity. The government has set an objective, as I've just said, that we will do this. And then, with all these elements, the next one that connects it all to the world is our economic diplomacy. The objective of our foreign policy has to be to create and further our economic security. Our foreign policy has to be such to enhance the economic security, and has been enunciated by the foreign minister, where he has said economic security is absolutely necessary, but we all know it is a long-term game, and an economic diplomacy takes time to crystallize. Ladies and gentlemen, in the end, I would like to say that Pakistan has been endowed with a strategic location, and it is a situation and at a meeting point of the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia. But during the course of our history, we have mostly suffered because of our strategic location. Time has now come to take advantage of our location instead of suffering because of it, but we use it as an advantage to us through our foreign policy. Our geostrategic location has to be complemented with geoeconomics. I would also like to propose that this forum should come up with its recommendation to further enhance the economic security of Pakistan. In particular, I would request that we come up with an economic security index along with a forecasting model, as we can have some basis on which we can have a debate through the various think tanks, is how are we doing on that security index. I would like to just now say that I've raised a lot of issues, but I'm not at all despondent. To me, this is just an economic process. We are still a very young country. We are still in the process of development. We must always be optimistic, as economic development is a long-term process. To conclude, I would like to just say that hope is the bedrock of this nation. The belief that our destiny will not be written for us, but written by us, for all the men and women who are not content to settle for the world as it is, and who have the courage to make the world as it should be. In the end, I would like to thank you all, to the organizers for inviting me, and for all of you to patiently hear me. Thank you very much.
honorable ministers, ladies and gentlemen, the honorable minister has very succinctly outlined the challenges. He's described the deficiencies which impinge on our national security, and he's also highlighted what the government is trying to do to rectify the situation, and he's also set an agenda for us to develop further, to create recommendations for creating a security index, economic security index. So it was a complete message, and we hope that we would be able to work on this. And now we move on to the remainder part of our session. I would like to call upon Dr. Usman Chauhan, who is the moderator of today's session, to introduce the other speakers and carry on the proceedings from there on.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat Saab, President CASS, Honorable His Excellency Razak Daud, you have set a great tone for what is a complex question, economic security. Because the tone has been set so rigorously, my remarks before introducing our distinguished speaker, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar Saiba, are succinct. What I want to convey now is that our government has set at the core of its overall security strategy very much the idea that economics is important. Anybody you ask will tell you that economics is important, and our thinking is being shaped around those lines now, thankfully. But economic security is a nebulous concept. Try to look up the literature on it, academic literature, and you won't find as much concrete stuff as you might imagine. For that reason, my ambition for the remainder of this panel is that we get nuances teased out. And those nuances regard some of the interplays of economics and energy, economics and globalization, economics and climate change, economics and diplomacy, and the list could go much, much further. But this is a good first step, and we should probably save something for the sequel to the first Islamabad dialogue, save something for next year as well. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Shamshad Akhtar Saiba, who was a person of immense prominence. She was our caretaker finance minister at one point. She was, more importantly, former governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, and she has held very important advisory posts at the United Nations and worked closely with the World Bank as well. And my request to our distinguished speaker is to help set priorities in economic security that are premised on her rich experience in observing Pakistan and even guiding much of the economic policy in her various capacities. So we draw upon her guidance in prioritizing economic security going forward. After that, I would like to reach out and introduce the other speakers as well. But for now, I defer to Madam Shamshad Saiba.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Air Marshal Saab, advisor to the Prime Ministers, both of them, Razak Daud Saab and Mohit Yusuf Saab. Thank you for inviting me, Mohit. Thank you for moderating this session. Economic security is undoubtedly critically linked to national security. Both are mutually reinforcing. However, disruption in one drags the other down, and vice versa. Hence, there is need for a holistic and granular understanding of the economic vulnerabilities, their intricate nexus, relationships, and risks for national security. A proper diagnostics of security risk requires surveillance of the global, regional, and domestic challenges, be it Pakistan or any other country. It also requires an assessment of opportunities for global alliances while tapping regional economic cooperation and integration potential. If one sub-region doesn't want to partner, we move to another alliance. That has some substance, of course. Robust and result-oriented partnerships thrive on trust and confidence, and for these to be successful, they need to be anchored on institutionalization of peace and security. And as student of EU, the Union, and ASEAN particularly, I must tell you that they were all initially anchored on peace and security, where there is an intergovernmental process underlying it. Now, there may be skirmishes here and there, but bottom line is to get peace and security right. Economic security lays the precondition for integration. Cross-border infrastructure connectivity and financial security are critical to promote trade and investment. Develop regional and global public goods so that you can give comfort to outsiders, and navigate through shocks and shared vulnerabilities with support of long-term adaptation and mitigation strategy. National security allows countries to be respectful global and regional citizens to attract economic and business relationships. And I don't care what international institutions say. I, as a citizen of Pakistan, want to be proud when I go with the international fora and say, well, I have achieved this compliance with the international standards. In contextualizing debates, there is need to recognize very briefly the international cooperation architecture, which I do believe has not served us very well as Pakistan, except for giving us more and more burden of debt, as I see, because we never fulfill the conditionalities or the policy frameworks that they ask us to structurally reform. So first, a word on this architecture. Globalization and multilateralism foster economic and trade growth and development gains undoubtedly. However, confidence in it has eroded as world moves from economic and financial crisis to pandemic and now sovereign debt surge with climate crisis unfolding as we speak. Unprecedented economic contraction from 2020 has resulted in loss of output, reverse progress achieved in reducing poverty, and resulted in job losses and growing inequalities. This is a very big shock. Second, global governance mechanism has delivered some results to the world, but it is fractured and dysfunctional, given the US-China tariff, currency, intellectual property rights, and other disputes, inability of UN Security Council to resolve long-standing political dispute, or pushing for MDBs to give voice to developing and emerging markets in sync with the demands of multipolar world. Security Council itself does not give effective representation to multipolarity. Third, as global uncertainties and divergence in recovery across the advanced and developing countries happens, the disparities and inequalities across and within countries will widen and breed economic insecurity, not only in our country, but in our neighborhood also, who knows. My fourth point is that the exogenous shocks are a reality, and regional destabilizing rifts will also remain a reality. So strengthening economic security has to be within our own geographical jurisdictions. It will have to be a prerequisite for feeding national security and national security feeding our economic security. So what ought to be the new drivers of growth and trade? They of course call for global community, not just our sub-region, but we want global community to encourage peace in South Asia region. They are behind ASEAN, I can tell you, because I have worked within the ASEAN tracks. With South Asia, intra-regional trade is barely 6%, and I know you all know this, There is, however, need to tap intra-regional trade opportunities in this region, which are anywhere from 80 to 200 billion, as per the UNS cap that I was leading at one point. And we need to, of course, if we can't resolve the politics, we can move towards the other partners. We have to work to reduce our trade costs. I know collectively the trade cost of our sub-region has to be reduced by 40% to bring it at par with ASEAN. And I think it will be a long way to have intra-regional trade of the level of ASEAN. So, of course, there's a lot of potential within SAARC. We undertook studies of SAARC power grid and market for electricity, cooperation in energy, resource exploration and trade. We developed intergovernmental platforms to develop an IT information superhighway system, promoted water security and food security. And of course, all this was with the desired intention to help the welfare gains for the public. Now, having experienced what I experienced in the South Asian tracks within the United Nations, my advice for Pakistan is to not only move on to the other friendlier components of the South Asia, but also go to ASEAN. India has fostered its relationship with ASEAN. And I was very much honored that the Indians invited me to speak on their India-ASEAN partnership. United States, China, Korea, New Zealand, Australia, all of them are behind the ASEAN. So why can't we try to penetrate in the more friendlier market of ASEAN and develop intra-regional trade there? My fifth point is that sustainability has to be at the core of economic security and leveraged through regional cooperation, as several sustainable development goals are transboundary in nature. Cross-border challenges such as climate change, water, food security, disaster risk reduction, ecosystem, natural resource management, sustainable energy are all complex endeavors, undoubtedly. But collective management of shared vulnerabilities and risk is the way forward as we are hit right and left by climate and disasters which respect no boundaries. At the same time, food, water, energy security cooperation could ease supply constraints and nurture efficiency. My last point, the sixth point, is that despite endorsement by Parliament, implementation of sustainable development goals, which is supposed to yield us a superior economic model, has unfortunately been very slow and uneven, relegated only to the Planning Commission, while it should be driven by diplomatic as well as the sectoral tracks at the highest leadership. Most worrisome to me are the climate change impact on food, energy, water security, and lack of effective management of nexus between these three. We call basically that SDG integration analytics, which is now being propagated across the world. Pakistan, unfortunately, is ranked 5th in the list of most vulnerable countries, with the greenhouse gas emissions expected to rise by 300% by 2030. It's a time when we should be getting rid of it. And implementing nationally defined contribution will require us $40 billion. Countries' air quality is second worst in the world. Temperature increases will be above global temperatures, and there is onset already of glaciers melting. Floods, as you all know, are recurring phenomena. Moody's has placed Pakistan in the most susceptible category to physical climate change, negatively affecting our sovereign credit risk and increasing the risk premium demanded by investors and creditors. So to mitigate the risk of the climate-related disasters, which will come close to none, is to ensure food security for our fast-growing population. The government's agriculture transformation plan, which I just got from some colleague, is a welcome step. Investment in resilient agriculture, water management practices, effective management of groundwater is critical. Energy transition has yet to unfold in Pakistan. We are going towards coal when the world is going towards cleaner sources. Well, I know we had no other choice. It is well recognized that increasing solar and wind capacity from 1,500 megawatt that we have today to 4,000 megawatt will raise its share to at least 30% of the total installed capacity by 2030. It would represent a least cost expansion scenario. It will give industrial competitiveness because renewable energy is cheaper. It will enhance our security and reduce GH emissions. Renewable energy policy has been there for 2 years. No increase in renewable share within this country except for drips and drabs. So let me conclude. A well-sequenced action plan to lift Pakistan's economic security, which would reinforce national security, calls for political solidarity, which would reinforce, of course, national security, but we do need political solidarity. We do need private sector involvement and community action. And Razak Daud Sahab is right. We have a very rich corporate sector, but we need this corporate sector to work without subsidies, without rent seeking, without getting any undue favors. Least of all, to be seeking basically what has been just talked about, tax holidays and tax incentives. No country has progressed with tax concessions and tax holidays. I can tell you from my 40 years of international experience, you end up wasting a lot of resources and you develop industries which can't withstand the international competitiveness or international competition. Pakistan, however, to me, the most worrisome faces macroeconomic insecurity and vulnerabilities that are compounded by the investment saving gap, which have been yawning. Fiscal deficits, we were told, would come down, but they have again reached record levels, requiring high recourse to borrowings. Current account compression in the wake of COVID is driven by curbing import demand. It will hurt industrial revival and industrial diversification. Rise in foreign exchange reserves, unfortunately, are primarily debt and FX deposits, sourced rather than earned through export earnings. So where is the economic security? We have to really strive harder for that. Unless growth regains strong momentum, low domestic resource mobilization, and low non-debt creating FX flows will raise debt sustainability risks. The biggest security risk today, to me, is unsustainable debt. Under the baseline and downside macroeconomic scenario, public debt will peak to 98.4% of GDP and 107% of GDP in fiscal year 21, respectively, breaching substantially the federal debt legal limits of 60%. Combination of exchange rate depreciation, weak macroeconomic fundamentals, repayment of market borrowings, and transfer of power holding private limited debt which we have now acknowledged to be a general government debt, has all contributed to the unsustainability of the debt. But getting the arithmetics right was right, as Razak Daud said, getting the figures and getting the analysis right is critical. So debt risks have mounted at a time when Pakistan has benefited from the G20 debt relief, which in the first round is close to 1.8 billion, and it will benefit for another year or so because G20 is working towards giving an extension of the debt suspension service initiative that I also am behind the scenes working with the G20 think tank group. So a state's risk vectors have to be shaped by the structure of the economy. Unfortunately, we have state domination in the industrial sector. The quality of our political and governance would be improved so that we could entertain the idea of having more integration, if not at a regional level, at the global level, because after all, we are a very open economy. But for all this, we need to improve the state of our finances. And we have to recognize that unless and until we diversify our sources from the banking to non-bank and capital markets and long-term institutional investors, including insurance industry, we are never going to have the depth and diversification so critical for growth and competitiveness of a country. Thank you so much, Mohit Saab, for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Saiba. After hearing the remarks of His Excellency Razak Daud Saab and Dr. Shamshad Akhtar Saiba, you may start to feel a little bit overwhelmed, even though they express optimism, because there are so many dimensions to discuss in the Pakistan context specifically. And so what I would like now is for us all to take a step back with a bit of higher order thinking. For that, I wish to invite Professor Miles Kaler, Distinguished Professor, School of International Service at American University, and Senior Fellow for Global Governance at the Council on Foreign Relations. His talk is going to be about economic security and globalization, which I think puts us and our condition in terms of economic security in a wider international context, which is transforming beneath our feet. Please, I yield to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be included in this very distinguished panel in a conference that is considering security in its broadest context. And I've been asked to address in a very brief set of remarks two controversial and contested concepts: globalization and economic security. Controversy surrounds these concepts because some regard them as simple opposites. Globalization, which has involved the opening of national economies to cross-border flows of all kinds, necessarily reduces economic security in this view. And during a global pandemic, one with severe economic consequences for both industrialized and emerging economies, it is easy to accept this position. Perhaps, however, this argument continues. The argument has been ended by the pandemic itself, since some have predicted that it has damaged economic globalization beyond repair. I would argue against both the proposition that globalization is winding down and that globalization is inherently damaging to national economic security. Let me address the first point. Even before the pandemic, globalization had become what The Economist magazine termed slowbalization. Following the global financial crisis, financial flows did not return to their previous peak, and global trade appeared to reach a plateau. As the Harvard economist Paul Antras has pointed out, however, on other dimensions, globalization continued to progress. For example, pre-pandemic, the share of migrants in the world population reached its highest level since 1990. I would point to two other features of globalization over the past 20 years that are particularly significant for economic security, and I would argue they will persist. The explosion of cross-border digital flows and the digital transformation of growing sectors of the economy, and the central importance of global value chains in the world economy and in world trade. Rather than creating new vulnerabilities for national economies, I would argue that these two features of globalization revealed pre-existing vulnerabilities and may contribute to enhanced economic security in the long run if they are properly managed. So what are the sources of economic insecurity in a globalized world? I mean, we will have many points of view on this panel about that, but I would point to three very briefly. First, and this is the conventional view, the actions of malign actors, what might be termed the classic concerns of economic security. Vulnerabilities that can be manipulated or exploited by other actors, whether states or non-state actors. Certainly, digital flows reveal new vulnerabilities. To name only one, the threat posed to financial systems undergoing rapid digital transformation that has been accelerated during the pandemic. At the same time, the sector has experienced the second largest share of COVID-19 related cyber attacks from criminal networks as well as states. So after the health sector itself, it is the financial sector that has suffered the most from these cyber attacks during the pandemic. There's also the issue of illicit financial flows related to an array of crimes, which remains a persistent problem for both global North and South, and in certain respects has been enabled by the growth of digital flows cross-border. Intricate global value chains have also become a source of concern as national rivalries intensify. The economic clash between China and the United States has been driven in part by an effort to decouple its global value chains in areas of military utility and technological importance. But this conventional concern over the threat from malign actors exploiting vulnerabilities does not capture other challenges to economic security in a globalized world, some of which have been mentioned by the preceding very distinguished speaker. The second source is the policies of major economies that can create unintended negative consequences for others. We can see, looking ahead, the fiscal stimulus recently passed in the United States is likely to create US interest rate increases, which will increase the debt burden of developing countries. The US didn't intend that, but that may well be the consequence. In similar fashion, the effects of the US-China trade war have been positive for some developing countries, but damaging for others. And third and finally, there are shocks of many kinds, whether originating in policies or natural disasters, that can now ripple very rapidly through the global economy because of its interconnectedness. The pandemic, of course, is a prime example. But earlier we had the 2011 Fukushima earthquake and tsunami. We have a current supply shock from the shortage of chips, which was unexpected because of the revival in world trade and has caused great distress in the United States automobile industry. And of course, in the longer run, and something that will be addressed by other speakers, climate change. So these shocks are a third and very important source of insecurity. What can be done? Conventional strategies become more costly in a globalized world and less effective as well. I think for solutions, we should look to societies that have managed these challenges to economic security successfully. And the overriding lesson, it seems to me, is that globalization is not the problem. It is the capabilities and institutions of societies that permit the beneficial economic effects of globalization to outweigh those that threaten economic security and economic well-being. Each strategy, national strategy to enhance economic security, carries its own risks or drawbacks. First, prevention, which is often regarded as or read as protection. So in certain cases, limited delinking or greater regulation of cross-border flows may be wise. We've now adopted a very pragmatic attitude toward capital controls, for example. But caution is also required. So far, US measures to decouple from China have not produced a reshoring of industry to the United States, and it has damaged US manufacturing employment and agricultural exports. Protection in the interest of security can easily become protectionism in the hands of powerful economic interests. Second, monitoring and filtering flows. In the case of illicit financial flows, separating good from bad flows and other negative flows as well. And here, new technologies, provided in many ways by globalization, such as using big data and machine learning, may help filtering the bad from the good. The risks are the economic cost to financial institutions and also the threats to individual privacy and control of information through this process. A third strategy is preparation and planning for possible shocks, which requires adequate intelligence and planning, but those plans will only be of value when the next shock arrives if they are implemented, and typically implemented with coherence and speed, which has not been in evidence, of course, with many of the plans for pandemics that were on the shelf in many of the industrialized countries, including my own, before the pandemic. Fourth, diversification. This is a familiar one, and this is a very helpful one because globalization actually encourages diversification. The risks in global value chains have been countered by many companies already with this strategy, and governments can clearly encourage such moves. The difficulty is that global value chains are very intricate, and they're not transparent, and obtaining the necessary information about them, which is often proprietary in the hands of corporations, can be very difficult. Another familiar strategy is insurance, and that was mentioned by some of the previous speakers. It's also popular, but it can be very costly. You can build up stockpiles for certain goods. You can build up reserves at the central bank, which is also costly. But also, and often overlooked, you require social insurance for individuals and families in the society as well against shocks of various kinds. And you can learn from past experience and adapt institutions accordingly, creating nimble and innovative national institutions. And here I would point to the example of Taiwan, arguably the most successful economy and country in dealing with the pandemic because of the lessons it learned from earlier experience, particularly the SARS pandemic in 2003. It created a dedicated public health agency that managed the prevention and control of pandemics and gave it the authority to coordinate other agencies of the national government. This was an innovation that really very few other governments deployed after the SARS pandemic, and it served Taiwan very well. All of these steps can be summarized by a term that was used by the previous distinguished speaker and has become popular during the pandemic, which is resilience. Applied to global value chains typically, but it could be applied to societies as a whole. Recognize the likelihood of disruptions and build in ways to deal with and minimize the effects of such disruptions and shocks. Economic resilience is finally built on trust between populations and their governments. Final and most important point, all of these national strategies to increase economic security are strengthened by regional and global cooperation. Indeed, in many cases, they will not succeed without such cooperation. At a minimum, such cooperation serves to discourage unilateral measures that produce outcomes that are much poorer at the national and the global level. And here I would point to a recent study by the Rand Corporation, which documents the cost to the industrialized world from vaccine nationalism. In other words, if the entire world is not vaccinated, there will be serious effects on the growth prospects of the North. So that demonstrates the interconnectedness and the requirement of global cooperation, even for purely national economic interest and security. So in conclusion, I would say we can assume that globalization may change, but it will not and has not gone into reverse. And given the many shocks that the global economy has experienced in the 2 decades of this century, sharing its benefits as well as countering its negative effects will continue to present major but not insurmountable challenges to national governments that aim at the security of their societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think one important takeaway from your enlightening talk is that what we see in our local context in terms of the challenges to economic security are also echoed around the world in a wider context. I think that's important for us to remember. And while Professor Miles Kaler covered globalization and transformation, I will invite in juxtaposition our following speaker, Professor Joe Aldi, who is a professor for practice of public policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, as well as a university fellow at Resources for the Future, as well as a fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And in addition, I should add that he not only had a great academic pedigree, but also a practitioner impact and a policy impact because he was closely assisting the Obama administration with its environmental policy. And what I would request from Professor Aldi is to share with us concepts of sustainability and partnership, particularly in energy and environment, where he has had a large academic and practitioner impact, the juxtaposition being transformation as globalization and then sustainability through transformations. I yield to you, Professor Joe Aldi.
Thank you, Dr. Johan. And thank you to the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies for the opportunity to participate in the Islamabad Security Dialogue. It's a pleasure to be with you, at least virtually. I wish we could be together in person, and I hope each of you are staying healthy as we confront and better manage the COVID-19 pandemic. I think this is a very important conversation about economic security. It is critical for us to think about the foundations for robust and widely shared economic growth, as well as the risks that may undermine economic growth, and the role of public policy in strengthening that foundation, and, to echo a term used by several of my colleagues already on this panel, for enhancing our resilience to these risks. In this context, I would like to focus my remarks today on energy and climate change and their role in economic security in Pakistan and across the world. Long-term economic growth requires improvements in productivity. Technological innovation has produced new tools and equipment, most of which relies on an energy source in order to make the labor of workers more efficient. Consider one of the most basic tasks we face, feeding ourselves, our families, and our communities. Over thousands of years, we have developed new tools to enhance the productivity of farming, to harness the power of livestock to increase farm productivity, and then to harness the power of tractors and other farm machinery to further increase the output for each farmer toiling on the land. As someone who grew up on a small farm and had chores as a child, I can assure you how grateful I was for that long history of innovation. But that kind of transition, new equipment, new technology, new ideas in concert with energy, has made labor more productive across many industries around the world. Whether it's making steel or cars or smartphones, we've seen how economies have grown as we use new ideas, energy, and people in more creative and productive ways. A reliable source of energy may not be sufficient for economic growth. We also need education and training. We need innovation in the production of new knowledge, and we need market conditions for entrepreneurship. These are all quite important, but energy is necessary for sustaining economic growth. A reliable source of energy can attract investment in new factories and service facilities, and a reliable source of energy can make it easier for our children to study and learn, and become even more productive workers when they are adults. Ensuring reliable power is easier said than done. As evident in many countries around the world, sometimes we can't keep the lights on. Even in the state of Texas, here in the United States just last month, we had a massive disruption of the generation and transmission of electricity. Pakistan has known challenges such as the energy crisis over the past decade, the difficulty of providing access to electricity throughout the country, and the challenge of reliably delivering power. Overcoming these challenges will create the foundation for economic growth, and in so doing, improving the welfare of the people today and their children and grandchildren. When we look back, for example, in the year 2013, the Asian Development Bank estimated that the power shortages in Pakistan cost about 2 to 3% of gross domestic product that year. And it's not just that we lost economic output that year, it's that we're undermining the drivers of growth in economic output over time. And it's that these effects that persist beyond the current shock to the energy system that can slow economic growth. Addressing energy poverty and energy reliability challenges through the growing use of coal-fired power, however, does pose serious trade-offs, as Dr. Shamshad Akhtar noted in her comments earlier in our session. Our economic growth and our social welfare also depend on the environmental impacts of the way we produce and consume energy. While energy can enable workers to be more productive through the use of equipment and tools, the local air pollution associated with the burning of coal and petroleum products can adversely affect our public health. This pollution causes asthma, chronic bronchitis, and even premature death. It can reduce agricultural output on our farms. And there's evidence in developed and developing countries alike that exposure to air pollution increases missed work days due to illness and lowers worker productivity. Even in the United States, where air pollution is lower than in many developing countries, a 10% reduction in air pollution can increase the productivity of workers in some occupations by 1 to 2%. The use of fossil fuels around the world for several centuries has provided the foundation for our modern economies, but also precipitated the climate crisis. The concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have achieved unprecedented levels in the history of our species. The emissions of carbon dioxide continue to rise, even if last year, due to COVID-19, we'll see a modest decline in emissions. And our emissions annually right now are about 60% greater than they were in 1992, when the world first reached an agreement to combat climate change at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit. The climate has warmed and will continue to warm, with average temperatures more than 1 degree C higher than the pre-industrial levels. Given the nature of the climate system, some of what we have already emitted will continue to increase the temperature of the planet around us. And when we look at all the existing capital stock, the power plants, the factories, the cars and trains and airplanes around the world, if we just use those to the end of their economic lifetimes, we're likely going to go beyond 1.5 degrees C of warming and raise the prospect of reaching and exceeding 2 degrees C. Scientists have warned us about the adverse impacts associated with going beyond these temperature thresholds, and in fact, it has mobilized some of the multilateral efforts to combat climate change, such as in the 2015 Paris Agreement, where the world agreed to limit warming well below 2 degrees C, but our actions to date are not quite up to that standard set by the negotiators and leaders in that Paris conference. When we think about the economic damages of carbon dioxide, right now it's estimated that the emissions that occur this year will impose $1 to $2 trillion worth of cost. That's the present value of all the economic damages spread over many years and across the world. But it's important to recognize we are realizing the adverse consequences of climate change today. Consider a few categories of damages. Flooding is a serious problem in the United States. It's a serious problem in Pakistan. The economic damages of flooding in Pakistan in the past decade are measured in the billions of dollars each year, with incredible disruption when we think about the destroyed homes and the farmland for the people living along major rivers. We think about the adverse impacts of heat waves, whether it's people who died in heat waves we've suffered in Chicago, heat waves that have occurred in Europe, or say the 2015 heat wave that struck Karachi. We have the adverse consequences on agricultural output, where both water stress and temperature stress can reduce our productivity of our farmlands. We think about the public health risk of greater spread of vector-borne diseases with a changing climate. They can also lower worker productivity. And we think about in general, whether we're seeing this now from lab studies or existing recent empirical observational studies of the labor market, workers are less productive in hotter environments. And as we have to spend more and more to adapt to a changing climate and to clean up the mess after the natural disasters that result from climate change, there are then fewer resources that we can dedicate to improving education, enhancing public health, building the infrastructure that also helps enable greater productivity and long-term economic growth. Indeed, recent macroeconomic research shows that warmer than typical temperatures can slow economic growth in developing countries. A 1 degree C warmer year causes a 1.3 percentage point decline in the growth rate in the year of that warmer temperature for developing countries. This effect actually isn't seen statistically in developed countries. Climate change is disproportionately harming developing countries and their economies, in part because of the disproportionate share of economic activity that is in more climate-exposed industries in developing countries, but also because there are fewer resources to adapt to those threats posed by climate change. And because this is affecting the growth rate, these are effects that are going to persist over time and slow the growth in the economy and exacerbate inequality among developed and developing countries over time. Now, this is recognized by Pakistan and its nationally determined contribution under the 2015 Paris Agreement. In that UN climate agreement, virtually every country in the world came forward to say, here is going to be our contribution to the global effort to combat climate change. Pakistan recognized its vulnerability to a changing climate, what we've already heard some in this session, noting that the threats that climate change poses to both lives and livelihoods, as well as what it can do to reduce emissions if there's cooperation with other countries. I think it's critical to realize how addressing energy poverty and increasing energy access and ensuring the full use of electricity is going to be important when we think about how we may adapt to a changing climate. Since air conditioning is something that is going to become more and more common in Pakistan and throughout the developing world, and is going to be critical as a way to offset warmer temperatures. Indeed, the energy challenge and the climate challenge are deeply interlinked in a two-way street. The way we have produced energy historically contributes to climate change, and climate change will place new demands and stresses on our energy system. Each of these are going to then pose threats to long-term economic growth. Now, we need energy to enable economic growth, but we also need to manage the risks posed by energy to the local environment and the global climate. These risks counter the benefits of energy for economic growth. And I think that's why we are seeing the global community really starting to ramp up its efforts to combat climate change. We've seen the EU and Japan last year say they're going to eliminate on net their emissions by the year 2050. We've seen China step up and say they will do that by 2060. And just recently, President Biden here in the United States has also pledged to eliminate emissions on net by the year 2050. We're going to need, in order to achieve and deliver on these goals, we're going to need better policies on energy and climate within and across countries. Policy frameworks that can attract investment capital to meet energy needs and address the climate crisis. Investors and inventors are ready. They need the policy predictability to really start the transformation of our energy system. Most powerful can be how we use the price of energy and to augment it with ways of pricing the pollution associated with energy such as carbon dioxide emissions, and ways that can send clear signals to the private sector on how to deploy existing zero carbon energy, such as solar and nuclear power, and how to invest in innovation in the next generation of clean energy technologies. We need economic coordination across countries to ensure that energy access, as well as to ensure that people are not choking on the air or facing the growing threats from a changing climate. Our national policies can have important international spillovers, and not just the negative pollution impacts, but also positive economic effects. We found in some of our research that the subsidies for solar power, first in Germany and then in the United States, actually helped drive down the cost of manufacturing solar panels, which makes it cheaper for everybody. People in Germany, people in the United States, but people around the world now to invest in solar power because it is now competitive with conventional sources.
May I just interrupt? We still have one speaker to go and we are nearing the end of our time.
Yes, my apologies. Let me wrap up. I do want to close by noting the importance of how we move forward multilaterally. We're going to see that this year with Glasgow, the Conference of the Parties in November. But we're going to see this in many other economic and political fora, whether it's the UN General Assembly, the G20, coordination of central banks around the world. I think when we hear former central bank governors talking about climate change, as we've had already in this session, it's clear that this is an economic issue as well as an environmental one. And in managing these risks, we can promote a more secure economic environment and enable robust long-term economic growth to the benefit of all people. Let me conclude the remarks now. Thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this discussion.
Thank you, Professor Aldi. There's a key takeaway from, among many others, in your talk, which is that economic security involves co-creation of value and working together. Climate and energy and all of these issues are shared problems, and I think we're all beneficiaries as countries if we work together to have a wider net of security. I'm pleased to announce that I have received permission, and I'll insinuate that it's because of popular demand, that we're extending this session by 15 minutes so that we have one more delightful speaker and an adequate amount of discussion and Q&A after. So with that note, I thank you, Professor Aldi, and now I turn to Harun Sharif Saab, who will be our speaker who has an extra burden, because now that we have covered global issues of economic security and local issues of economic security and the synthesis between them, how do we move forward in the world in terms of taking economic diplomacy? Harun Sharif Saab is a visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. He is a former Minister of State of Investment for the government of Pakistan, and he has been a member of the Prime Minister's Task Force on Economic Diplomacy, which I've been a part of as well. And sir, for this economic diplomacy challenge we face, given all of these issues locally and globally, I defer to your guidance, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chauhan. Air Marshal Kaleem Saadat, President CASS, Dr. Mohid Yusuf, distinguished panelists. I think much has been said. I would like to try and capture the context in which countries, particularly Pakistan, have to set up the economic diplomacy approach from a geostrategic to geoeconomics, as we hear quite often from this government functionaries. So we are living in a world where now multiple economic power centers are emerging, mostly led by China and in Asia. And that is something Pakistan has to see very carefully. It's called the Asian century, and the challenge for Pakistan would be to tailor our economic diplomacy in a manner that we catch up with the levels of East Asia or ASEAN. We have been left behind, far, far left behind for multiple reasons. We do see US-India Cold War, US-India partnership and Cold War on China to continue in the medium term, despite China's, resistance to stay out of it. But as it was mentioned, that somehow it has led to the forces of protectionism and forces of crony capitalism as well at times. Regional connectivity can play an important role, but regional connectivity is not only about connecting through roads and or travel only. It has to be knowledge oriented. We need to understand economies around us, much, much better. Pakistan needs to invest. We have not even invested enough understanding China well. So this is something we need to very carefully think about. What I see in this region, which is South Asia, frankly, by now we should write the obituary of SAARC. But what's happening in South Asia is that I see two blocks emerging. One is India and the East, which is Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh. And second, Pakistan is very well positioned on West and Central Asia and Western China. Now, these markets in the near future are likely to be connected, likely to be interactive. And that is where the dialogue will move around sub-regional themes, not necessarily the traditional South Asian theme. Two more contextual points. So now, the point was raised that, Pakistan needs to strengthen the industrial base. I think it's an important point. But as we move towards the fourth industrial revolution, Pakistan needs to very carefully see that what kind of competitive industry Pakistan needs to have in order to go forward towards sustainable growth. If we continue putting, in the leaky bucket, which we say, which has been drained to our, resources through patronage and subsidies, then perhaps that industrial base might not be something one should look for. Digital transformation and future of jobs. For a country with a young population, we need to see that industry will not create jobs and the advantage of cheap labor will disappear in the coming years. And that is where perhaps serious thinking on efficiency-based skills to knowledge-based skills transformation would be needed. Now, with this backdrop, what's happening, around us, I actually, I'm very, very pleased, and it's been acknowledged, the Prime Minister's commitment towards enhancing economic diplomacy, regional connectivity. This is what he said in the morning as well. The key issue is that how to manage that transformation. There is an institutional angle. There is an angle of, picking winners. So let me try and do a few points on that dimension, that how Pakistan can actually demonstrate to the world or signal to the world that, yes, we can do it. The investors in private sector are key, but they look for tangible commercial transactions and capability to structure it. And opening space is only a very tiny little, step to do that. Countries have grown rather rapidly. So, this whole school of notion that economic development is a very long process, it's partly holds, but look at Indonesia, Chile, Cambodia, Vietnam, the growth has come in, in the span of 20 to 25 years. So we need to learn from these, the people who have really grown in our lifetimes. And Pakistan can do it if we put our house in order. Now, as I've mentioned, that no country in the world has achieved geostrategic to geoeconomic transformation without breaking the mindset which says that we can't do it. We need to look at it that, patronage-based industry hasn't really helped Pakistan at all. And the massive borrowing which we are getting into without building innovative financing and saving instrument in the financial market will continue to push us. Now, Pakistan's growth projections are 1.5% to 2% for next 2 years. Now, that is no way enough for a population of 2 million young people coming into the labor market every year. Now, we have very bright opportunities. I'm not at all pessimistic here. I'm just giving you the challenges which we need to get out of denial and actually face it and do it. And countries have done it. Now, what we need to look at is that if we need sustainable growth, we need to look at it very carefully, our comparative advantage, which is not based on state patronage. Now, for instance, Pakistan could be a hub of food security, not for only our own country, but also for the smaller countries in the region in the Middle East and Western China. But for that, we need to make massive investments in research, in economic zones, in value addition. Why companies, large corporates, we all need. But large corporates will only come to this country or be formed if they have the comfort level that any dispute resolution, any other issue will be resolved within the law of the land. What Dubai has done, what Qatar has done, what Kazakhstan has done, they have set up independent financial centers where dispute resolution, where flow of capital, where banking systems, everything is housed there, and nobody can touch you, or harass you in property rights and other things. Pakistan needs to bring in foreign investors here, open up the market, give them comfort zone that yes, if you come here, you're protected. At this point in time, the fragmentation and over-regulation of the state actually stops the number of corporates entering, Pakistan. So what I wanted to say was that if we can seriously look at our economic model based on our competitiveness, we have wonderful, pockets of competitiveness. Look at the city of Sialkot, which is 13% of our total exports. Now, without any subsidy, without state support unnecessarily, they have built their own infrastructure and they're working on it. So we need to learn and leverage that industry rather than basically going to the same school which has been thriving on state patronage. So that is message number 2 for that. There are 2 more quick things I would say, and then I'll stop. Pakistan, as I said, the 2 blocks emerging. Now, what are we offering as economic diplomacy to our neighbors? Now, there has to be a commercial value proposition. And one of the key things at Sussex, I'm working on China, post-COVID China. One of the key things which China has done in economic diplomacy is that they first put economic commercial transactions on table and structured the dialogue around transactions rather than opening up space and waiting for somebody else to make the transactions. Now, Pakistan at this point in time in our government system does not have the capability to come up with transactions of regional nature. We need transaction managers, we need engineers, we need financial sector experts. We don't have financing. I would make 2 propositions for that. And this proposition is actually based on some realistic dialogue. I think Pakistan should lobby and reach out to China and set up the regional office of Asian Infrastructure Bank in Pakistan. That will not only bring the resources, and it should cater Central Asia, Afghanistan, and others, but it will bring much needed capability to do transactions. And at this point in time, similarly, Asian Development Bank's regional program makes absolutely no sense being in Manila. So frankly speaking, the proximity in future, Pakistan should try in multilaterals. Let me tell you, India at the moment hosts 14 multilateral programs in Delhi, not in Washington. So Pakistan needs to look at it that how we can offer a space that people move in. If we want to take leadership in connectivity, why can't the ECO office be moved now to Pakistan and revolved? These things are a little bit, why it's in Iran for so many years. Pakistan's prime minister is giving positive vibes. Pakistan's foreign ministers has been giving vibes, but there needs to be backup by strong institutions of commercial transactions. Dr. Shamshad Akhtar has very rightly mentioned a commercial bank-based model cannot raise the level of savings and investments which we need to grow at a sustainable level. We need to deepen the financial market and bring players internationally. There's a fear of global companies entering in Pakistan, I'm afraid. And that is where we need to break the barrier. and bring them in. There is capital roaming around in the region, in sovereign wealth funds, but mind you that this will not be translated into transactions unless we put together the projects which are not only viable, but also we ensure best corporate governance, that these are managed on international standards. And private sector could do it. It cannot be done in the state. And we saw when, the money was asked for friendly countries to bail us out, it was linked to an economic package as well. We struggled to structure the economic package. In 2.5 years, we could not do privatization alone. So my question is that strengthening these institutions, taking them out of the ministries which are already not efficient, and handing over to professionals will give a signal. Foreign Office, many countries in economic diplomacy, they have created a cadre of economic diplomacy. So maybe if 10 countries are priority, we should put on our best ambassadors there and create incentives for them. Still, our ambassador would like to go to Geneva's and New York's and Washington's, not there. So these are few thoughts, because the world honestly is looking for signals from Pakistan that this is a country which offers potential, but can also do transactions and ensure, property rights and dispute resolution. So these were few thoughts, and I remain optimistic and very happy that this dialogue is happening. And I congratulate the organizers for organizing it and giving me an opportunity. And sorry for the Pakistani colleagues, I perhaps took some of their dinner time.
Thank you very much, Harun Sharif Saab. That was a very good coverage of the challenge that we face and how we can move forward in terms of economic diplomacy. I want to acknowledge that the social media has been active and has sent us some questions. So I want to acknowledge it, but I don't want to pose those questions because they're very well covered. For example, 2 were about how can we move forward with economic diplomacy, which was the crux of Harun Sharif Saab's presentation. That was Zainab and Aisha. And then there was another question by Zishan about the impediments to a progressive economic regime, which I think is the crux of every speaker's presentation. So what I would like to do instead with these 10 precious minutes is to ask about the microphones and ask the audience to pose questions. So if the microphones get to them, otherwise, please raise your hands as you have, and I'll ask you to articulate. I'll re-articulate into the microphone. Sir, please, in the gray jacket.
My question is very simple and short. The Canadian Indian scholar T.V. Paul in his book, The Warrior State, Pakistan in the Contemporary World, has proposed the thesis that Pakistan's geostrategic unique position in the world has actually become a curse rather than an advantage for Pakistan. So I believe it's totally correct that Pakistan over the years has not actually been in a position to diversify its social and economic sector. So why do you believe that this has happened? Thank you.
So the question of the gentleman was quoting the Warrior State book and the mentality of not incorporating economic security earlier, and why was it a warrior state? Your Excellency Razak Daud Saab, I would request if you wish to participate in this question, otherwise any of the speakers are free.
I think they've got some very good professors that who can answer this.
Right, sir. So I'll request particularly Shamshad Saiba and Harun Sharif Saab, why do you think that this transformation and mindset wasn't adopted earlier, and how can it be done at a short interval, let's say? I mean to say the transition from having a traditional security mindset to an economic security mindset. How can it be achieved quickly? I think we'll rephrase it like that.
Arun, you want to have a shot at it first?
Well, I just said, look, this transition, it's a very interesting transition. And this is what I'm trying to say, that once the leadership has taken a position, and a very positive position, because that's where the word is going, let's not get into the past that why we couldn't do it. There are multiple reasons Pakistan became a proxy state or whatever. Now, if we need to achieve this transition, that's what I'm trying to say, that we need to believe, and it has to be transactions-led. It cannot be done through talks only. So Pakistan should be able to offer, commercially viable transactions to partner countries, and selected countries, our capacity is very limited. So we need to, rather than just reaching out to rest of the world that we are open for economic diplomacy, we need to very carefully target, and I would say ASEAN, I would say Central Asia, I would say Western China, and a few countries of Middle East, not more than 8 to 10. So a practical way forward. The moment nothing will succeed like a success.
Right, sir.
So far, our projects of international nature have really gone bad, either because of policy inconsistency or some disputes, or Pakistan's capability not to manage it well. And we need to look at it very carefully, that how we could do. And for frankly speaking, there are very easy transactions which we can make, not only with Afghanistan, but also, we can offer to the Middle East, as I said, the food security. Pakistan could be a hub of, a digital services system here in Pakistan for the neighborhood. But for that, we need to put that composition on table. The mindset that somebody else, like a donor country or an outsider, will come and make it for us needs to be stopped. It has to be done by ourselves, and private sector has the capability.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Shamshad, would you wish to add to that?
No, I think Arun has covered it. My own view is that we may think we never paid attention to economic security, but I have to tell you, in my earlier days in Pakistan, when I was at the World Bank office and was dealing with multiple sectors and multiple planning as well as other subjects, I have to say, I think Pakistan did connect with economic security issues. The fact that Pakistan had early on self-sufficiency in food, Pakistan had better institutions at one time. So it's not as if we never paid attention to economic security. We did. It's just that we got lost somewhere because of the war on terrorism, the dedicated attention that could have been given to long-term economic development and economic growth was somewhere lost. And second, I think we forgot to build institutions, and we got carried away with emulating this model or that model. When we have now we have recognized that institutional building and partnership with the security institutions will reinforce our strengths. And as we can see, we are talking about economic security not on a standalone basis, but with the national security organs, is how I would take it. And over the last few years, I think there has been a conscious attempt to dovetail these. And I think hopefully with this experiment, we should be able to reinforce the nexus between economic security and national security. Now, economic security is a huge subject, and we need a lot of homework to be done, as some of us were alluding to, like trying to figure out how do you get the climate right, how do you get the energy right, how do you get the water security. And it's not as if these subjects were not studied during different periods of Pakistan. They were, but they weren't like glued as they are being glued now by this event. I hope I was able to answer that.
Absolutely. In the interest of time, I just want to make one more comment because I think it adds to the coverage of the topics we have. Economic security has so many different facets, and we understand that. Mushkilein itni ke aasan ho gayi. There's so many mushkilein, but we are all optimistic. There's also a question of macro and micro. A lot of our discussion today, based on what I had requested, was macro, but I want you to think about microeconomic security, which is, for example, that they are 40,000 road deaths nearly in Pakistan every year. And usually the people who die are the breadwinners. So the family that is affected by the road death of one person has lost its economic security. So it's not something always to think about in the abstract, but it's something very visceral. You will actually know people who have lost their economic security. And from that micro stance, we go out to macro. And with that, I think we've demanded a lot of patience from our speakers, our audience, both virtually and in person. So President Saab, Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat, our keynote speaker, His Excellency Razak Daud Saab, our distinguished speakers who are in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Washington, Islamabad, and Karachi, our audience physically here and virtually, I wish to thank you, and I also wish to thank the National Security Division for having organized the first Islamabad dialogue, and it has been a wonderful experience for all of us, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
If I may ask, the speakers have done an excellent job. We are not really magnanimous with our applause, so can I ask for an applause for all our speakers? Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure with you.
Thank you, Air Chief Marshal Saadat, moderator, and the distinguished speakers for an insightful discussion. Now I would request you for a group photograph on the stage. Wear your masks. Thank you, sir. Okay, I don't think so. I think इसी तरह कर लें. Okay, this brings us to the end of the first day of the Islamabad Security Dialogue. For the second day of the Islamabad Security Dialogue, we will be joined by Chief of Army Staff, General Qamar Javed Bajwa, Foreign Minister, Mr. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar, Mr. Ali Jahangir Siddiqui, Dr. Sania Nishtar, Dr. Faisal Sultan, Mr. Malik Amin Aslam, Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jalani, Dr. Huma Bakai, Mr. Mushahid Hussain Sayyid, Dr. Hu from China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, Ms. Laurel Merrill, and Ambassador Dr. Akbar S. Ahmed. For the second day of the Islamabad Security Dialogue, the key themes of discussion are human security, regional peace, and evolving world order. The opening session at 1 p.m. by Chief of Army Staff will be live streamed, and attendance will be through invites. Another announcement that the remaining dialogue sessions from 3 p.m. onwards will be virtual with restricted physical presence from media, NST, and advisory board think tanks. Thank you very much.